This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And it's the 27th of June. And now the day lengths are beginning to get smaller. We're at the peak of summer. The prairies are out. I had a phone call from Doug DeLong, who 20 years ago I visited his place and he got bitten by the prairie bug. So not this Sunday, tomorrow, but the next Sunday, we'll be going to a prairie in Champaign, and perhaps I'll go back to see what his prairie is like in southern. It's on the brink between the glaciation of the north, which is very, very fertile, and the less glaciated regions of the south that are more clayey. And actually, I talked to the fruiterers, and the rich soils of the north are not as good for some of the vegetables and crops, especially those that need to expand. So Kerry has her supply from the south, and she gets from farms there. And it's interesting, you see how things change with climate. I tend to be aware that there's a lot of food that's wasted, so I grab peaches that have a pockmark that don't sell very well, and I noticed that every peach was split. The achene in the middle was split, and I asked Carrie what the problem was, and she said, well, it rained at an appropriate time, and these were basically freestone peaches, but they almost become clingstone because they grow very fast, and they grow too fast, and they split. And so those little things are what make for good farming and selling. Some things come in and out. It's sometimes very brief. You have to be there when the season is on. People call me about penstemons. Penstemons for a week or so were everywhere. They're called birsang, and they're prolific in the Scott Park and other places. And now it's almost time to gather the seed. The hyacinths have come and gone. And some of the liliaceous plants are out. Michigan lily, I think, is out. We know where one or two of those species are. Not many, but they have habitat requirements and climate requirements, and they may flower, but they may not seed. That's enough of an introduction to this almost the equinox of the summer. I see the yellow cone flowers are out, and they bee balm or monad, or there's another name for it, botanical name, and it's out and it's purple. They the milkweeds are out, and I talk to people who used to walk the bean crop and with a hoe to get rid of the milkweeds. Now we're trying to encourage them. It's different. We're still looking at Market Street. It's a street that was very different. It was lots of bars and gaming and kind of on the raunchy side, but we like its character to stay, and that means we have to think and dream beautiful thoughts about Market Street. Today I want to talk about grottos, sacred places in different communities. We were being settled in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and many of the people who came here disenchanted because there were wars in Europe. There were territorial wars. There were religious wars. There were Catholics who had one concept of religion. Jewish people had another concept of religion. Muslim people had another. And pagan people were there in the background. Amazingly, animals and humans or animals like to get together. And they get together in different societies, and they often make up their own rules. And some of the rules are pretty stringent. And animals do the same thing. All the whales come together in a certain place, and that's they nudge each other. They rub each other's backs. The horses get together and top and tail with each other and scratch each other's backs. I just watch the geese in the pond that nobody enjoys because of the pooping everywhere, but they have about 40 young ones at the moment, and they decided to go from land into the pond, and there are the parents leading, and every child goose or gosling was in order, in a line, obeying some sort of rule that you don't know about, but may be controlled by a sound or a movement of a senior goose that's watching the crowd. And then there's usually a goose behind. They're watching the crowd, and as they grow, they get to be more liberated and allowed to do things that they wouldn't do early. They graze a lot. So it's interesting to watch how humans work. I want to remind you that a few people together, even individuals, can make a difference. Early ecologists at the University of Illinois were Vestal and I'm forgetting. Status weights, not status weight. I forget. But the early ecologists had a student named George Fell, and he was from Rockford, and Shelford was the extra person, and they were a team, and they would work with the Big Four, and they nominally rented railroad right away between Urbana and Mayview, and George and his wife Barbara went off to Washington after they'd been stopping on a potential airport runway that was going to take out Prairie, and they created the Nature Conservancy, which is now worldwide. And it's something the same way people came here as leaders. Sometimes they were priests or had grown a background in Europe, which then modified when it came to the States. So you can do things with a few people and create some rules, and it works. It works for humans, it works for animals when humans are an animal. And I can remember growing up with New Zealand had a dolphin, and the dolphin had sort of centered around people. So children could ride it, and it seemed to be in need of that contact, which we missed in the period of just recently. There are other animals like dogs that get to associate with humans. There are plants that associate with each other. So we need to encourage those things. I have an evil mind of looking at East Central Illinois and looking at a rail trail coming in from Bloomington and looking at Danville and a Kickapoo Trail and Decatur and a trail from Monticello in that direction, down to Migment and east to Paris, and a region that really needs some attention to have a network of rail beds and parks and cemeteries and places like drainage ditches that allow humans and creatures and plants to communicate. A butterfly needs to fly from one place to another. It's amazing that as city dwellers have been putting in natural areas, the amount of wildlife activity. Well, Jim Zanzi and others have for a long time been interested in how people came from Europe and what some of their interests were. And one of their interests was in grottos. And grottos go back to Rome. They go back to Lourdes in France. And so we had, Jim got together with Lisa Stone, and they're both interested in this sort of discussion. And they wrote a book called Sacred Places and Other Spaces, Jim Zanzi and Lisa Stone. And why I mention this is that early on, after doing about 10 years of work with various departments and agencies within the University of Illinois, we got bold. We went public and came to downtown Champaign. And then we ran an early prairie conference at Muhammad, and that was successful. And some of those people got together. We formed the Grand Prairie Friends, and that's been rather successful. And I had a debate with my attorney, who was Bob Dodd, who had also been mayor of Champaign-Urbana, and he would come to our meetings, and he had been a prelate in the Catholic Church and had retired from that and married out from the church and acquired a large family. So he had many fingers in the pie. He was an attorney. So he had a legal base. He was a citizen interested in community. He was well read and grew up in the Springfield area. He had a family that was fairly heavily into the church, and there was an attachment to biblical learnings and a feeling that citizens needed to walk into some spaces that were unique. They may be underground caves. They may be a church spire that would be seen from miles around. There may be a nave or church that was tall and impressive and with a different sound. So it's interesting to try and figure out what activates people. And often it's a matter of leadership. It might be that if you have a church, or if you have a city building, or if you have a sports place, it's a place where people meet. And over and over, the conservation people will tell you, please talk to each other because you pick up information. And we do that. We do that on Market Street. We're looking at Market Street for the artists and Weft radio people and the Urbana Public Television video people, and the things like YouTube are different media venues, but they're all on the same street. And when we came here, we came here to a dead central business district. Everyone had moved to the malls. So we went to the Cressy Foundation and asked if 4 of these buildings could be nonprofit artists, scientists, alternate people that brought life to what was a dead community. And before that had been East Central Illinois mafioso, and then followed that it was a engraving companies. And so we're in that block that has 2 rows of 8 buildings, 100 feet long, one facing Market Street and one facing Walnut Street, with a 40-foot alleyway between. And so the sequence had been citizen involvement, and then a need for people to come to town and expend their check and play games and perhaps go to Chicago. They needed to get their harness repaired in a harness factory, which used to be on Market Street and still is. It was occupied by the News Gazette. You put your horses in a livery stable and you had a wild time. And that kind of supplanted the more sensible shops that were the fronts, the coffee shops that might be a front to starting price betting. And so we have a history on Market Street. And the buildings are not that old. They're perhaps some of them after World War I. And you have some of that character of World War I. You have a town that was getting to have T-model Fords, and they were having to face 26 trains a day, and that tested the patience of people. So then the railroad went from nearer to Market Street, just probably 50 feet away from Market Street. They put it over east. So where it is now is there because they brought glacial till from Paxton and raised the railroad so that there could be underpasses. in the middle of those 6 underpasses, the land is deeper, but at the two ends, as the railroad went back to its more normal terrain, the underpasses were a little shallower. So I see that and St. Mary's Road, the underpass is being remodeled because it's easy for the semi-trailer to get in and under, and the front goes up and the back is still up, and you scrape your semi-trailer on the roof of the underpass. So, thinking about these things, what do we do on Market Street to keep it native? How can we keep the arts in buildings that are worth much more than they were? The value has gone up from perhaps 25,000 to more like 300,000, just because gentrification is around, and the value of the building is valued according to other buildings that have been bought recently. It's comparable, and we poor folk are left with thinking about how to survive as your value of your building goes up, so the tax base goes up, and if you're running on a low budget, that means you have a hard time surviving. So, and then if the parking goes on and up around, then the artists are going to have to move out of town, and that's disappointing. So if we are going to put up a $250 million ice rink near to the MTD building so that we can have large venues in town, then you have to think about how some of that population of people that will come will be interested in finding out about Champaign, about the streets, about the railroads, and so we have to provide that sort of facility. Some of these buildings have been gutted in their day, and they're high, so you could have a visual material there that was interesting, right amongst the panoply of people. By July 2nd, there will be music right outside our door, right outside Weft, and there'll be hundreds and hundreds of people here and different bands. They've cut down the number of locations to 2, and 1 will be outside our door on Market Street. And people come, and they came with their children, and the children dance to the music, and dogs come, and dogs enjoy each other's company and sometimes don't. So you have to make sure they're on a leash. So it gets to be a friendly sight. And over and over again, I have people that come who are familiar with our pocket prairie across the road. And it was in a way a grotto for all manner of people. Some might want to find the prairie forest ecology there that would save me taking people 20 miles to a decent prairie. Some would just enjoy to sit and read. Some smoked a joint occasionally. Sometimes there'd be a little beer. One had to be surveilling the place all the time to just remind people to behave themselves, because this was a rare event to have a more or less a grotto in downtown Champaign. It was a unique site, and as people these days write notes about memories of the pocket prairie. So let's now go to how we got into the discussing grottos. Well, I, for many years, thought that we needed to communicate about prairie, especially, and the prairie landscape, the prairie forest landscape. And one of the things we did was to have a reading the landscape course at Parkland College. It started off with something like 26 people and gradually got less and less as we taught this. People gradually got the idea, and then we got things like the master gardener and the master naturalist, and gradually the prairie has benefited from that communication. One of the things we did was to take field trips, and one day Jim Zanzi, who was professor at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, we hardly even knew this, and he was also head of the department, and he came on one of our field trips and enjoyed it, and felt that people learned a lot, and they did. And they went back to these places, and so we knew that this was something that was valuable. And then Jim Zanzi suggested that we do an artist in the landscape course and at the School of the Art Institute, and we did that for probably the best part of 10 years. We started off with my van that held about 10 or so people, and it wasn't the most convenient, but gradually we morphed into wagons. So we had several cars, and then we had a bus, and eventually we ended up with a bus that had a toilet on it, and water and a video camera, and that was important because people do need to go to the toilet, and they do need to drink water, especially young children. And so we gradually matured as the years went by. It was mainly for senior students or faculty. And some of those students would come back 2 and 3 times because we heard it the first time, but we need to hear it the second time. The problem with us is that the second and the third time might be totally different from the first time, and that was interesting too. So Jim had an associate. He used to go to Clinton in Wisconsin, the southern part of Wisconsin, almost adjacent to Illinois, north of Rockford, more or less. And there was a farm there that had changed with the agricultural changes. And the farmer had been to art school. He was kind of alternative. And they had closed the cattle barn. They still had hogs, but he had converted this almost into a retreat, and people came. And the nearby one teacher school at the end of the road was closed because of school consolidation. And the farmer bought that, and he planted plants with a verve for imagination. And the people around him knew him, but they were also bothered by him, especially people who were in the police force. They didn't understand his style and dressing. And the people that came to his colony, and his mother, who ran the show to some extent because she knew how to farm. So they still had farming. This was more or less, in sarcasm, a Midwest ranch or Midwest beach. This is where you could swim in the prairie. And so it was was different. You could sleep in a sleeping bag in what was the barn's loft, and you could certainly wake up in the morning to the sound of hogs waking him also very early. So Jim knew the farmer, and gradually Jim had been for years intrigued by sacred places and people who did things that were interesting, that were not for making money, they were for making sense. So Jim had this background of photography and sculptures, and he also lived in Chicago, but had a retreat in Hinesboro, which was down south. So that's how I got to meet Jim, because I would go to Arcola where he would often be. We were joined by Lisa Stone, and there was an Isa from these were two young ladies who actually worked with the farmer, took the farm truck and paddled around Wisconsin looking at strange places and giving lectures about it, and being funded by the Wisconsin Arts Council. And so Lisa joined the crowd. We were two for starters, and then we were three. And so Lisa and Jim were part of the Art Institute, School of the Art Institute, not the institute itself, but the school. And they were knowledgeable, much more knowledgeable than I, but I had the role of looking at prairies and geology and landscaping. And so we were a functional team. Now, what did we visit? We would visit places in 5 states, and what I want to talk about is grottos. So if you go back to Europe, you had fairly stringent rules of the game. There were people going to the Crusades, and then there were break-offs with different ideas. There were Muslims and Jewish people in Spain that didn't necessarily get along with each other, so they migrated. There were at the other end, Eastern Europe was again very different, and Russia was Finland and Latvia and Estonia, more or less Russian, and the Balkans down south, more south, the Norwegians and the Swedes, and you had people moving across to England and taking over from the Celtics. So there's a lot going on in Europe, always has been, and it continues. We have current day wars about who owns what where. Armenians have lost out, and the Germans have various interests and inclinations, and don't always get along with Jewish people. So, and then there was a Dutch reform, and the whole countries that were Catholic, and difference of opinion within that framework. Well, some of those people were prelates who went to schools in Europe and then migrated to the US. And those people fall into different categories, and that's what I wanted to talk about. The first type of person was an artist who was going to plan he was appointed to a certain location in Iowa, and he was wanting to put in a grotto, but it was very formal. He was going to have a pond that was dug. He was going to have items that were high, because height gives you an idea of the wonder of the world. And he was going to have rocks. He went around the country finding places where he could souvenir a crystal. Actually, it's not what you think you ought to do. If you're a prelate these days, you don't take a unique crystal off of an underground cave and put it in your church grotto. But he was very formal to the point that he would contract out to put grottos in other places. And gradually a number of people would pick up on the idea. And so different churches had different interests. And then in Wisconsin, not too many miles away, perhaps even influenced by this person, another person that came from Europe with a formal training. Both these people had been to a college in Madison or Milwaukee, perhaps, and had studied here. And when appointed to different locations, had different ideas of what they should do, and perhaps sometimes controlled by the bishop, who would want to have a new church or a school or what have you. The second type of person, still trained in respectable religious colleges, would be appointed. One was appointed to Dickerville in southern Wisconsin, near to the Mississippi River. And he saw his responsibility to put in characters and grottos, but it was more a community involvement. It was 3 citizens of that very small community had died in World War I. And so there was a memorial. There was a feeling for the country, flags, and whereas those elements would not have been in the more art pure grotto in Iowa, but taking the ideas, taking the like of 12 stations over the cross to augment. And it was in an era when concrete had been formed, and the concrete could be speckled with shards of crockery or what have you. The first gentleman was likely to be more formal. The second gentleman was probably more likely to include vernacular things and just allow the community to come and worship in the grotto, but also visit the memorial and be obedient to the flag. So Dickyville became famous for its grotto, and hundreds of people would visit it. And the grotto in Iowa would be the same. And then there was another assignment. It was a priest that was asked by his bishop to establish a school. Well, they had a school, they didn't have a church, but this priest took it upon himself to put more nature into his grotto. Uh, still the feeling of being impressed by a large tree root or by a large stone or by a mound of country rock with a cave in underneath it. And this gentleman was also a leader. He got the help of a young student who continued his help right through the life of the priest. And people have taken on that genre and continued the grotto for many, many years. And once again, all these three places were visited in the Midwest, and especially in Wisconsin, Iowa, perhaps in the Dakotas. This was when you had to think about the Louisiana Purchase, where the U.S. got more land, and some of these places were in charge of huge areas, like it was a territory. And one of the reasons why Jim got into this is that he kept running into the feeling that the East Coast and the West Coast had pizzazz as far as art was concerned, and so the country folk were out in the boondocks were a little on the folksy side, and that didn't really count. So Jim was going around looking for places that said something different, and the spirit was different. So here you have three different ways of looking at a grotto, and including spirituality. Some were quite rambunctious. The school hall was the church in the last case, and the bishop got rather upset because the community was getting big on this grotto and having people visit, and there was no church yet. So the priests got together and they put together a church. And now there are a bunch of people watching and impressed. Some people would purposely visit a grotto to get ideas. So think about this in your own day. Think about an idea and going forth. So there's George fell out there by Mayview thinking about an international nature, TNC, Nature Commission, Preserved Commission. And he's not necessarily a whiz-bang student, but he has an idea. And he went to Washington and bought a house along with his wife, Barbara, and they were sort of joint souls. Often these projects have women involved that are part of the continuity, whether it might be to continue this sort of project after the death of the initiator, or it might be that there are women who have fit into a pattern of having children and being at home and doing all the feminine things that they're expected to do, that some of them have a mind of their own and a spirit, and they get up to do things, and they create sculpted pieces that take elements from these grottos and add their own spirit to it. One couple came from Germany with one son, and they were farmers, but gradually they got to create a silo, an elevator that would store grain, and then gradually they got to think about grottos. And they were not necessarily a grotto. They might have been more Lutheran in style. And some of the churches were getting to say that they don't want a lot of graven images. They would prefer to have a plain church. And but these people were wanting to be so grateful that they'd come to the US and been able to do interesting things. So part of their sculptures was a thank you. There was a religiosity in there. But they would paint houses with concrete stucco, and perhaps have an eagle, or have the political statements like an elephant and a donkey pulling a cart, and the comment is, how can you get along with two so different political parties and have it work? To imagine an elephant and a donkey. So the two symbols for the Republicans and the Democrats. You might have a tree with several monkeys in it, and underneath the tree is a gentleman drinking, and he's making a monkey of himself. So this goes beyond the art. So Engelbrecht, I think, was the name. Jane, usually a European name. A gentleman well traveled around the world, but settling down in the unglaciated area of southwest Wisconsin. The unglaciated area was where the glaciers went around, and it's much more rolling, and it includes Dickeyville, and it gives character to. So the farmer stopped producing cheese and dairying and whatnot, and his wife helped to move things along. He wanted to express himself, and she was wanting to express herself too. So, but she was very good at selling machinery, farm machinery. So she would walk for miles to sell machinery, and that was probably one of the major incomes. So there were 20 or 40 sculptured pieces in the long run. It may have been Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and Paul Bunyan in the background, or an eagle, or flags, or, and statements, and usually on a highway, so that vehicles had to stop to see what the heck was going on here. And so they had parking places, and most of these loosely knit people, but very tight in other ways, allowed visitors. The Wagners that were doing things more informally as Lutherans were right on a road, and they had interesting fences, and even their graves are interesting. They're very interested in peace, because Europe was not in peace, and here they found peace, and so they worked with each other, they started off with one child that was born in Europe, but they ended up with 6 children, and the children were part of the workforce that put this sort of thing together. And the children would work with the visitors that would come. And in these days, this was probably the early 20s, early 30s. There was no television, there was theater, but there were places to visit, and cars had become a travel event, and so people enjoyed to go look at things, and the children would be assigned. The visitors in one case were not allowed to take photographs because they had their own postcards, and their own postcards could be sold, and that's how they this part of the income, and people would agree to that. And, so they made a facsimile of the Bremen, the ship that brought many migrants to the U.S. And the child would stand behind the ship with a mirror, and people could look into the mirror, and the image of the ship was almost, as the child moved in one direction, it was like the ship was moving across the ocean. So there's a certain sort of cleverness to some of these things. In the long run, that particular place called the Glass Corner was not only religious and patriotic, it was fun, and the family was involved, and in many cases still is involved. Sometimes it's taken over by a firm that would put this into action. I think the Kohler Foundation has made this particular one a site to be remembered and renovated. The last image that that group put together was a wedding cake for their 50 years, and shortly afterwards the husband died, and then shortly again the wife died. But once again, a team of men and women working together, and children working together, and history, and where did this come from? Where did something originate in Lourdes? And did people come to get a feeling of strength, the scenery, the height of the building, or these quietness, the stone that is in nature, and so one woman took off on her own after half a dozen children. She gradually started to put together imagery that was quite fantastic. She would make a fireplace, but the fireplace would be embellished with all sorts of often cheaper materials, not like the first person who would souvenir a stalagmite or a crystal. And she went on to have a zoo, and she also had 6 children to help put these items together and explain them to people. And I've talked a little about Smith, who was in Phillips, and he has like 200 sculpted pieces, and also a lot of fun, where the Indian will be bigger than the person that is dominating over the Indian, where a dual wedding of people married but blind drunk in a go-kart with horses pulling it. And it takes talent to put these things together. And it takes people like Jim and Lisa to do this, but to write. So I've been with them for many times, but their writing includes details that you don't get by just walking around and taking photographs and listening to the people who know this show better. And so think about how this movement proliferated in the southwest corner of Wisconsin, and also to the north at Phillips, to other places where there's inspiration, where there's one gentleman who had been farming all his life, but he felt there was nothing he was really doing and challenging. So he put together a museum. He had a lot of unique and historic equipment. Some of the things that people worked with in their day used, but they were obsolete, like an 8-foot saw has been replaced by a chainsaw. The 8-foot saw is not useful anymore, except if you want to play music on it, you can bend it in different ways. So little stories like that make it interesting. And he put up a fence line that was rather unique, and gradually put pieces in and made a museum. So I think we're getting near to the end of our time. So I will say that WEFT is providing this sort of opportunity for us and to talk about things that are interesting in the landscape, and it makes living and being in Champaign-Urbana interesting. We have all these people at the university, but we also have a bunch of people outside the university that do interesting things, and so you should listen. The other day I went to the next door neighbor. They have a parlor that actually does sculpting, tattooing, and so one of the 9 visitors for Boneyard was dealing with the Riggs brewery, and she's taking materials that are not used usually, like rhubarb, to take some of the elements and provide flavor, not necessarily alcoholic flavor, but the finery without necessarily the alcoholic problem. So I think that's probably, we'll get into this again. It's not the end of it by any means. I think this is a book that you should find. It's on the vernacular side, but it's also academic, and it's Sacred Places and Other Sacred Spaces and Other Places by Lisa Stone and Jim Zanzi. And it's an interesting history of this particular art form. Thanks for listening. Get involved yourself. Do some interesting things. Talk to people. Do things you think you'd never ever done before, but you might try. Thank you.